Hey there, welcome back to another week here, Biogeography. This week we are we're kind of getting to the end here, and this module we're talking here about island biogeography is kind of the culmination of everything we've been talking about. It's going to kind of like put every little piece that we might have talked about individually, sort of in this one all-encompassing theory of biogeography, specifically island biogeography. But you'll see as we go along how its components sort of make up or are comprised of all the individual things that we might have talked about, like immigration and dispersal and speciation and all of these things, evolutionary lineages and things like that. So it's probably the most interesting of all of this, I think. It's probably one of the cooler things, and it's one of the most well studied, uh, what I want to say, sort of theories of island biogeography, or sorry, of biogeography in general. Okay, so just to sort of kick this off, there's been a lot of studies of islands and biodiversity on islands and how those trends might change on different islands. And part of the reason why there's been so much focus on islands, even though islands are such a small sort of total area of the earth, is that they are nearly perfect settings for natural experiments. And this is because of their sort of natural variation in a lot of characteristics like size, isolation, the way that they were formed, and the climate that they have. So there's all sorts of different types of islands in all sorts of different types of areas, and they're sort of these little tightly controlled things. And so, you can't really, you can't break off a chunk of a continent and let it float out and see how biodiversity changes. You can't really do that. So islands are sort of as close as we can get, and their variation allows us to sort of um, mimic or I guess I'm not really sure what the right word is here, but it allows us to sort of get at the laboratory settings that we might want to change. You might want to look at how climate impacts. So you're going to find, islands that are similar in other things but differ in climate, and there's enough islands that you can do that. And you do the same thing for isolation or size or how they're formed, and we can sort of create these laboratory-like settings and allow us to test different hypotheses. So that's one of the reasons islands have been so heavily studied and have such a high influence on some of the theories and ideas in biogeography. So before we really get into the crux of what island biogeography is, I want to sort of just talk about in a little bit more detail what some of those specific characteristics of islands are and what makes them really well suited for studying these things. So just to start off here, there's roughly three, like most islands can be categorized into one of three types. They can be oceanic, so they could form basically from volcanic and plate tectonic processes going on and just form in the ocean as independent things. They could be remnants of land bridges, or they could be continental shelves. We're kind of lumping these into one. So they could form, they could become submerged or exposed, but due to changing sea levels, which happens with glaciation and changing climate and stuff. So that can create islands that exist or don't exist at certain times. And then they could also be continental fragments. So they could be a piece of the continent that has broken off as continents move around and over the geologic history of the earth and tectonic movements and things. Continents can, little pieces can break off and become islands. And so usually islands can be categorized into one of these three types. And there's actually a ton of islands, probably a lot more than what most people realize. So if we, and it depends kind of how we define it, but if we take this sort of general definition of an island as any landmass surrounded by oceanic water and smaller in area than Greenland, then there's actually over 85,000 islands. So that's a lot. So that's another reason why there's so much diversity in the islands themselves. Kind of allows us to use these as natural settings for biogeographic and evolutionary and ecological experiments. Um, Most islands tend to be pretty small. And so if we look at this figure here, we're just looking at the distribution of islands as a function of their area. And we can see that most islands are pretty small. So this is on a log scale, but you can just think of this as representing, low area and high area. Um, Most islands fall in this, and so it's a small area. So most islands are pretty small, and the physical and climatic conditions among islands tends to be interdependent. And so what we mean by that is this figure is a little bit chaotic, I guess would be one way to put it, but it's basically showing the strength of the correlation between these different characteristics. And so, a positive correlation would mean that these things increase and decrease together. A negative correlation would mean as one characteristic increases, another one decreases, and it's just showing you that strength. And so we can look at a few of them, like the area, excuse me, of surrounding land masses is somewhat correlated with the rate of climate change since the last glacial period, but it's very negatively correlated with the distance to the nearest mainland, which is also negatively correlated to whether it's a land bridge or oceanic island. This is also positively correlated to the area of the surrounding land masses. The island area itself is positively correlated with elevation. We can look at some climate stuff, like the annual temperature is very negatively correlated with the rate of climate change since the last glacial period. It's also negatively correlated with the seasonality, so like the variation on an annual basis. And that's also negatively correlated with precipitation, which is also negatively correlated with the rate of change. So not necessarily like expecting you to memorize these things, but the point here is that a lot of these characteristics are related to one another and tend to vary in correspondence with other characteristics. And other ones are not necessarily as strongly correlated, but you can basically, the point of this web-like, net-like structure is to show that there's a lot of connections between these characteristics. And we can actually look at these in a little more detail and it might become a little more clear. So, like I said, most islands are small. We have the frequency again here. We're looking at the area and just, the distribution. It's basically the same figure we just saw. Most of those islands are pretty small, but there's some geographic and spatial stuff going on here where the color corresponds to the area. So we can see like up in the Arctic, there tends to be some larger islands, and in the Indo-Pacific sort of Australian region, there tends to be some larger islands too, and maybe a couple off the coast of Africa. So there's some spatial stuff going on as well, but the overall trend is that most of them are small. Most islands are also at low elevation, and so this doesn't have nearly a strong of a relationship. They're a little bit more better distributed, but you can definitely see as the elevation increases, you definitely get a decrease in the frequency. So definitely most of them are at low elevation, but there are there are clusters of high elevation islands in the Indo-Pacific region, and again up in the Arctic. Some different things going on up there. Um, Most islands exhibit low variation in temperature, and so if we see, there's a large cluster, like most islands are kind of clustered around the equator. That would correspond to a higher temperature, obviously. So you're seeing, the most frequent temperature is the higher temperatures, but then you're getting sort of a spread out distribution for the rest of them. And there's sort of two things going on here. One, yeah, most islands are at the equator, and so they're going to have a higher temperature, and the equator just doesn't have as much variation in temperature. It's pretty much hot all the time. So you're going to get low variation. Another thing is that islands, by definition, are surrounded by water. And what we know is that those oceanic climates tend to have the ocean can have, or large bodies of water, I should say, can have a moderating influence on the climate. Whereas if you're somewhere inland, you might experience really extreme variation, like high highs and low lows temperature, compared to if you're on the coast, it's going to be a little bit more moderate. So islands get to experience that moderating climate a little bit too. So it's a little bit two things. There's the fact that they're all clustered here, but there's also the fact that the oceans tend to moderate the climate. Both of those contribute to the low variation in temperature. And also the low variation in the seasonality of the temperature. So here we're just looking at the variation, whereas before the previous figure was showing the actual temperature. This is the variation. So probably some metric of like the difference between the maximum and minimum temperatures. And you can see that most islands have low variation. Very few islands have really high variation. And so basically wherever you're at, whatever your average temperature tends to be, the temperature is usually around that. It doesn't vary very much from the average temperature. So there's not a lot of variation. So that's characteristic of a lot, except up here in the high latitudes in the Arctic, you do see higher variation in temperatures. Similarly to temperature, we could look at precip or precipitation, and we see most islands exhibit low variation. So here, most of the islands have low precipitation, and there's actually probably less geographic variation. There's maybe some higher levels of precipitation in this area, but for the most part, most islands have low precipitation. This should probably say low precipitation. We're not really looking at variation here. We're just looking at the precipitation. This slide is more about variation, but it's the same trend. Wow, I should have checked these. I'm sorry. This should say precipitation because that's what we're looking at here. But again, whether you're talking about temperature or precipitation, the variation tends to be pretty low. And that's again due to the moderating influence of oceanic climates and things like that. And so we can see most islands fall in this category where it's just having low, 0 to 50 millimeters annually. So lower precip in total and lower variation in precipitation. Okay, so that's just sort of a bit of background information about islands. There's no reading, so just keep on working your way through the module, and in the next video we will get into a little bit more of what island biogeography is all about.